A tank gun is the main armament of a tank. Modern tank guns are large-caliber high-velocity guns, capable of firing kinetic energy penetrators, high-explosive anti-tank rounds, and in some cases guided missiles. Anti-aircraft guns can also be mounted to tanks. As the tank's primary armament, they are almost always employed in a direct fire mode to defeat a variety of ground targets at all ranges, including dug-in infantry, lightly armored vehicles, and especially other heavily armored tanks. They must provide accuracy, range, penetration, and rapid fire in a package that is as compact and lightweight as possible, to allow mounting in the cramped confines of an armored gun turret. Tank guns generally use self-contained ammunition, allowing rapid loading, or use of an auto-loader. They often display a bulge in the barrel, which is a bore evacuator, or a device on the muzzle, which is a muzzle brake. History. World War I. The first tanks were used to break through trench defenses in support of infantry actions, particularly machine gun positions during the First World War, and they were fitted with machine guns or high-explosive firing guns of modest caliber. These were naval or field artillery pieces stripped from their carriages and mounted in sponsons or casemates on armoured vehicles. The early British Mark I tanks of 1916 used naval 57mm QF 6-pounder Hotchkiss mounted at the sides and sponsons. These guns proved too long for use in the British tank designs, as they would come into contact with obstacles and the ground on uneven terrain, and the succeeding Mark IV tank of 1917 was equipped with the shortened 6-pounder 6CWT version, which can be considered the first specialized tank gun. The first German tank, the A7V, utilized 57mm Maxim Nordenfeldt fortification guns captured from Belgium and Russia, but mounted at the front. The early French Schneider CA1 mounted a short 75mm mortar on one side, while the Saint-Chamond mounted a standard 75mm field gun Indiana the nose. The thin armor of the tanks meant that such weapons were effective against other vehicles, though the Germans fielded few tanks anyway, and the Allied tanks concentrated on anti-infantry and infantry support activities. World War II. This thinking remained pervasive into the dawn of World War II, when most tank guns were still modifications of existing artillery pieces, and were expected to primarily be used against unarmored targets. The larger caliber, shorter range artillery mounting did not go away, however. Tanks intended specifically for infantry support, the infantry tanks, expected to take out emplacements and infantry concentrations, carried large caliber weapons to fire large high explosive shells, though these could be quite effective against other vehicles at close ranges. In some designs, for example, M3 Lee, Churchill, Char B1, the larger bore weapons were mounted within the tank hull, while a second gun for use against tanks was fitted in a turret. However, other strategists saw new roles for tanks in war, and wanted more specifically developed guns tailored to these missions. The ability to destroy enemy tanks was foremost on their minds. To this end, the emerging anti-tank gun designs were modified to fit tanks. These weapons fired smaller shells, but at higher velocities with higher accuracy, improving their performance against armor. Such light guns as the QF 2-pounder, 40mm, and 37mm equipped British cruiser tanks and infantry tanks in the late 1930s. These weapons lacked a good high-explosive shell for attacking infantry and fortifications, but were effective against the light armor of the time. World War II saw a leapfrog growth in all areas of military technology. Battlefield experience led to increasingly powerful weapons being adopted. Guns with calibers from 20mm to 40mm soon gave way to 50mm, 75mm, 85mm, 88mm, 90mm, and even 122mm caliber. In 1939, the standard German Panzer had either a 20mm or 37mm medium-velocity weapon, but by 1945 long-barreled 75mm and 88mm high-velocity guns were common. The Soviets introduced their 122mm in a turreted heavy tank series, the Iosif Stalin tanks. Shells were improved to provide better penetration with harder materials and scientific shaping. All of these meant improvements in accuracy and range, although the average tank had to grow as well to carry the ammunition, mounting, and protection for these powerful guns. While high-velocity tank guns were effective against other tanks, for the most part British tanks moved to a dual-purpose 75mm gun capable of firing a useful He shell, later in the war adding 76mm 17 PDR gun-armed tanks for better anti-tank capability. Many nations devised tank destroyers during the war, a vehicle specifically designed for anti-tank work, and armed more heavily than a tank on the same chassis could be. They generally fell into three overlapping categories: improvised modifications of old or captured tanks to render them viable again, such as converting the machine gun-only Panzer I into the Panzerjäger I, often with haphazard, poorly protected, limited traverse weapon mounts, the American offensive and mobile reserve model, which favored lightly armed open-top vehicles with a rotating turret and a powerful anti-tank capable gun while relegating true tanks to infantry support role. Exemplified by the M10 tank destroyer, and the casemate gun mount model, which often allowed the resultant vehicle to be hard to hit and have a well-sloped and heavily armored glacis plate, for instance, the Su-100. The relative superiority in armament of tank destroyers was only relative, however. For instance, the Su-85 was a casemate type TD on the T-34 chassis that was rendered obsolete once the basic T-34 switched from the 76mm gun to the same 85mm cannon, producing the T-34-85. After World War II. By the end of the war the variety in tank designs was narrowed and the concept of the main battle tank emerged. After World War II, the race to increase caliber slowed. Slight increases were made between tank generations. In the West, guns of around 90 mm gave way to the ubiquitous 105mm L7. This lasted a long while with a shift to 120mm in the 1970s and 80s. The UK changed in the late 60s with their Chieftain tank. In the East, the 85mm quickly yielded to the 100mm and 115mm U-5TS gun, with the 125mm caliber now standard. Most of the improvements were instead made in ammunition and fire control systems. With kinetic energy penetrator rounds, solid shot and armor-piercing shell gave way to armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS, a product of 1944, and fin-stabilized, APFSTs, rounds with tungsten or depleted uranium penetrators. Parallel developments brought rounds based on chemical energy, high-explosive squash head, HESH, and shaped charge high-explosive anti-tank, HEAT, with penetrating power independent of muzzle velocity or range. Stadiometric rangefinders were successively replaced by coincidence and laser rangefinders. Accuracy of modern tank guns is improved over earlier weapons by computerized fire control systems, wind sensors, and muzzle referencing systems which compensate for barrel warping, wear and temperature. Fighting capability at night, in poor weather, and smoke was improved by infrared, light intensification, and thermal imaging equipment. Technology of the guns themselves has had only a few innovations. Throughout the history of tank guns, they have almost exclusively been rifled weapons, however most modern tanks now use smoothbore guns. Rifling of the barrel imparts spin on the projectile, improving ballistic accuracy. The best traditional anti-tank weapons have been kinetic energy rounds, whose penetrating power and accuracy decrease with range. For longer ranges high-explosive anti-tank rounds are more effective, but accuracy is limited. For extremely long ranges cannon-launched guided projectiles, CLGPs, are considered more accurate. The use of the autoloader has been a development favored by some nations and not others. Some countries adopted it as a means to keep the overall size of the tank down. Interest has also been shown as a means to protect the crew by separating them further from the gun and ammunition. For example, an autoloader allows the use of an unmanned turret in the T-14 Armata. Smoothbore. In the 1960s, smoothbore tank guns were developed by the Soviet Union and later by the experimental US FRG MBT-70 project. Based on their experience with the gun-slash-missile system of the BMP-1, the Soviets produced the T-64B main battle tank, with an auto-loaded 2A46 125mm smoothbore high-velocity tank gun, capable of firing APFST's ammunition as well as ATGMs. Similar guns continue to be used in the latest Russian T-90, Ukrainian T-84, and Serbian M-84 as MBTs. The German company Rheinmetall developed a more conventional 120mm smoothbore tank gun which can fire Leha missiles, adopted for the Leopard 2, and later the US M1 Abrams. The chief advantages of smoothbore designs are their greater suitability for fin-stabilized ammunition and their greatly reduced barrel wear compared with rifled designs. Much of the difference in operation between smoothbore and rifled guns shows in the type of secondary ammunition that they fire, with a smoothbore gun being ideal for firing heat rounds, although specially designed heat rounds can be fired from rifled guns, and rifling being necessary to fire HESH rounds. Most modern main battle tanks now mount a smoothbore gun. A notable exception are the tanks of the British Army which used the 120mm Royal Ordnance L11A5 rifled gun until the 1990s, it was then replaced with the 120mm L30 rifled gun which remains in service. The Indian Arjun tank uses an Indian-developed 120mm rifled gun.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.